Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. My name is Andrei Covatario. I'm a Director of Energy and Climate Mitigation at Climate and Water Initiative, and I'm very happy to be moderating today's conversation, COP30 in Brazil. Can global climate cooperation be rebuilt? We are recording this conversation halfway into the COP30 weeks, so we can already sense some interesting details being discussed in Belém. And as the world nears a decisive moment in the global climate agenda, this COP serves as a critical test to advance basically the ambitious NDCs and deliver on long delayed climate commitments. So, for this reason, we are bringing this webinar and we are putting together a panel of leading experts and scholars of CWI to examine the relevance and resilience of the UNFCCC COP framework in 2025, as well as to assess what realistic outcomes can actually be expected from COP30 at this pivotal moment, as well as how the next COPs ought to look like. We will be basically exploring recent challenges to global climate governance and climate action, and the political economy of achieving net zero targets across different regions of the world. So, to this end, I'm very happy to be joined by an excellent group of experts and scholars from CWI, and allow me to introduce the panelists. I'll start with Mohamed Mahmoud, CWI Chief Executive Officer and Founder, Laurent Lambert, CWI board member, and also Lama El Hatou, CWI senior expert, environmental geopolitics and sustainability integration. Thank you all for being together with me today to discuss this. And I want to start us to kick us off with the past, basically. Looking a bit at the past, I think we'll get a kind of a clear vision of what's ahead of us. And I want to basically start by asking you what has happened since the last COP, since COP29 last year in Baku. A lot of things have changed globally, not only on the climate front or the energy front, but I guess trade, politics, geopolitics, and so on and so forth. And I'm trying to basically assess how all this have basically impacted, for better or worse, I guess for worse, if we are discussing the previous year, the climate action and the efforts done or the advancements in the energy transition process. So, what has happened over the last few years in this regard? And Mohammed, maybe I'll start with you this round of questions.
Sure. Thank you, Andre, and I'm happy that we're doing this in the midst of COP30. I'll focus on one aspect of what has changed that I think is maybe would feel like an externality, but has imposed a lot of pressure on the state of the global climate agenda, which is a lot of geopolitical shifts, a lot of economic shifts that I think are, uh, I wanted to say bearing fruit, but the opposite of bearing fruit in terms of keeping that climate agenda going. The world is in the midst of really, really challenging economic conditions. Obviously, as citizens of the world, each of us feels that differently, but we all feel it. But I think that also rolls back up to nations and governments. And the reason why that's relevant is because, over the last couple of years, certainly I would say more prominently during the two COPs that were in North Africa and the Middle East, in both Egypt and the UAE, in a sense, money was flowing, right? You saw a lot of commitments, financial commitments for a number of initiatives related to mitigation and to a lesser extent, even adaptation. And it feels in a way that that well has dried up. There are still financial commitments that are happening. We've heard things coming out of COP30 in Brazil, modestly in comparison. But also not just new funding, but even some of those prior commitments seem to be not sturdy of those different sort of funding streams and initiatives that came out of UAE and Egypt and even to a lesser extent in Azerbaijan. So that, even what we have committed to is at risk versus in addition to what potentially could be forthcoming. The other thing that I think has a more qualitative impact on things geopolitically. Obviously, several wars are raging in the world. Civil wars are raging. That creates a distraction in a sense, not to diminish obviously the magnitude of those wars that are happening. But when you have such really dire circumstances occurring around the world, climate doesn't seem such as an exciting topic in nations' agendas and things to prioritize. But the other aspect of that is nations have sort of faltered in terms of their leadership in or being more active participants in the discussions. And obviously, I'll point at the elephant in the room, which is the role of the U.S. My personal perspective, and this is maybe not fact, but this is how I perceive it. U.S.
Mhm.
has never really been sort of a make it or break it nation in terms of moving the global climate agenda, but presence matters, right? And I think at least during the previous administration, you had what seems to be representation and participation. John Kerry was attending the COP. So even though the US's actual impact on mitigation efforts may not be as large, right? Because it has to go through Congress, and that has its own deadlock prior and even more so now. Uh, but at least they were engaged. And that, in a sense, their presence can influence others to actually come on and bring on meaningful impact and participation, a la the UAE and others, either nations that could spend money or nations that could implement programs with said money. But obviously, with the current administration, it's not just that all of that has grinded to a halt. In fact, I'd argue that the current administration is acting against the global climate agenda in terms of pulling out of the Paris Agreement, doubling down on things that actually proliferate emissions as opposed to halt them. So to me, that's sort of the state of play that we're in now, and it really colors everything that comes after.
I think there are lots of things to unpack, especially around geopolitics and whether or not this void that the US has arguably left behind, will be filled or is already filled by someone else. But we'll get into that pretty soon, I'm sure. Laura, maybe I'll turn to you. How do you see from your position the last year? What has changed? What has impacted the climate action? How do we stand today?
Wow, that's a big question. And to be honest, I would like to rather answer what has not changed
Sure.
because all the main aspects of the climate governance have changed in a sense.
Hmm.
Um, in a sense, Mohammed alluded to, for instance, the US administration now doubling down on oil. And I would like to say that there's never been as much oil and gas production in the US. And this is shale energy, so it's even more polluting than back in the days. At the same time, when you have the US not stopping, mitigating their emissions, then China decides that, well, I will not double down on my own efforts. So China still produces a huge amount of, let's say, solar equipment that they can sell abroad. They will still produce, they are the biggest producers of electric cars if you take all their companies. But they will not accelerate their mitigation strategies. And
Yeah.
this is exactly what we know we should be doing. Now, I'd like to put things a bit in perspective so that we really appreciate where we are now. When there was the lockdown, the COVID-19 lockdown, the emissions decreased by global emissions 8 to 9%.
Hmm.
This was the biggest lockdown we had ever known because this was the first global lockdown, which was followed in almost all countries. Yet only 8 to 9% of emissions. The problem is that if you read the reports from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, we would have needed for a few years already to have 6% in average of decrease our global emissions,
Yeah.
meaning almost a lockdown every year.
Yeah.
So we are very far from it. And as Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations, just said a few days ago, um, probably now it's impossible to stay below 1.5 degrees of increase in global mean temperature compared to pre-industrial times, which is one of the two key targets of the Paris Agreement on climate change.
Yep.
Now, what does it mean? If you read still the latest assessment report of the uh, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, you find that a huge number of ecosystems in the world, vital ecosystems, will start collapsing.
Mhm.
At a 1.5 degrees Celsius, and we are very close to it now, of increase in temperature, 70 to 80% of the coral systems in the world will start dying. And these are hotspots for a fish stock reproduction. And thus, what does it mean? It means that gradually fish stock will sharply decrease. And that is something by steps, but it will sharply decrease within 10 to 30 years. We don't know much because we've never been in that danger zone. What is really important to understand that then it will affect coastal villages, then it will affect huge areas of especially the global south, but also in the global north. My point here is that we are in a period in time where the past year, in terms of stopping the commitments, the previous ones, and that's the US, but that's also China, and that's also a number of other countries. You know, the Japanese have not been doing so well since the Trump administration decided to stop all the projects. Because, by the way, I had something that Mohammed alluded to, but the US administration has also stopped the financing of ongoing projects, which in terms of disruption is terrible. Because
Mhm.
normally when we make projections for the future, we consider that what has started will continue. But climate projections did not anticipate that there would come a president who will try to disrupt as much as he can of what has already been accepted. By the way, this is without much precedence that an American president decides to stop projects of international cooperation on this scale. The disruption, not just for climate science, but also for climate projects, is without any precedent. Now, to answer to your question, what has changed? This has changed. The role of the US, the international leadership, because Mohammed alluded to a point which is right, is that the US have always been cautious.
Yep.
Even under President Obama, they've been really cautious. There is only under Al Gore that there was a kind of real leadership. Yet, because of the size and might of the US, it had a de facto leadership in climate negotiations. And so this is disappearing. And the world is now, and that's the reconfiguration happening now in Brazil, and I'm almost done, sorry to be long,
Yeah. No, no, no.
but there is now the work of a coalition of willing on
Yeah.
various kind of themes. So some are really working hard on climate finance. Some others are working really hard on ecosystem adaptation. Some are really working hard on, coalition of vulnerable groups like indigenous communities. There is the matter of gender, which is also emerging. And this is important to see that we have, to some extent, at least within the framework of the climate negotiations, a more multipolar world which is emerging. And I'm not sure that the White House had really anticipated that withdrawing so much from climate negotiations would lead to a reconfiguration of climate negotiations and its multipolarization. And I'm not thinking it's so great for the US.
Thank you very
Yeah,
much. I think, yeah, of
sorry,
course.
sorry. I want to give them a chance to talk, but just to add a finality to that point is, unfortunately, Laurent, I don't think they care, right? I mean, that's the reality. That's the reality.
I think we'll touch upon that and also on again the void that is left behind. And I think Laurent, you stole half of my next question and also responded to half of it in terms of the Antonio Gutierrez statement on what's ahead of us and how certain actually those projections of reaching 1.5 degrees already in the next decade is. And how what's next from that, but we'll come back to that. Now, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that. What has changed over the last year, whether or not there are things that you are seeing from your position, and whether or not climate action has been affected, at many levels, and how do you see that?
Thank you so much, Andre, and thank you for your initial inputs, Mohammed and Laurent. Both very a lot. It's hard to follow that. There's quite a bit going on there, and so I'll try to unpack. There's quite a lot going on there that needs to be addressed, I would say. But I'll go to the first one, which seems to be the elephant in the room, which is the US's withdrawal from Paris, and what does that and how does that manifest around the negotiations and around multilateralism as it stands.
Hmm.
I think that we are at a very pivotal time in history where multilateralism is at risk, and I think that that's something that we're thinking about. Um, and it hasn't, and I would argue, and there's been this sort of this consensus both by Mohammed and Laurent that the U.S. has never really been a pivotal actor to a great degree in the climate negotiations. I would argue slightly otherwise, actually. In that if we think about the US in other multilateral environmental agreements, it's actually been a huge stake. If we think about, for instance, the Montreal Protocol and the way that they've actually pushed forward, they were one of the pivotal actors in moving that forward. And again, different dynamic, different animal altogether. CFCs versus fossil fuels is a whole other ball game. With alternatives that are less intensive versus the fossil fuels and the fossil fuel lobbyists and all that come with it as business industries. But that being said, the US as an actor towards global environmental agreements, for setting the stage for ESG compliance, for instance, for putting the EPA as one of the first leading actors on a global level to put standards down for water quality and air quality and on a global level. And I think that those are markings of both domestic action that have translated into international action, both for if we think about international standards that the World Bank has even implemented, ENS performance standards or other standards on a global level, followed suit from what a lot of the US environmental and social standards have been put in place. Now, climate is another ballgame. It is another ballgame. It's another animal, as mentioned altogether. And to what both Mohammed and Laurent have mentioned is that the U.S. has been cautious, and of course, it makes sense for them to be so. But even under some of the most progressive, let's call them quote unquote progressive leaderships in the U.S., most notably, if we would think of as the Obama administration under which the Paris Agreement was signed, we need to consider that during Obama's time was one of the most aggressive times of oil and gas industry fossil fuel extraction. So, I mean, and production. So, even that being said, the US never halted when it came to fossil fuel production, even under the Obama administration, which, if we think about Paris and climate and moving that forward, even if we think about Biden administration with the Inflation Reduction Act and the instigation of moving that forward on a domestic level, phenomenal policy. The IRA really moved forward in terms of allowing renewables to be incentivized, which many, mind you, Republican states actually benefited from. Interestingly enough, there's quite a bit of research that's coming out from our institution that's actually looking at how the state that actually profited the most from the IRA, now that the US has now sort of dismantled the IRA in its stance, but the state that has dismantled that profited from it the most during that time was interestingly enough Texas. And for very notable reasons. There is a very strong business case behind going into renewable energies. And the Republican states know it, and they're businessmen, and they're wonderful, amazing businessmen, and they know it. So that being said, even though Texas, one of the most oil producing intensive states on a federal level, has benefited from the IRA the most when it comes to renewable energies and solar and wind. So that being said, we do want to say that on a federal level, even though the U.S. has withdrawn from the international process, domestically, there's actually a lot happening on the state level.
Yeah.
Actions that are happening, for instance, in across California, across New York, state level policies in terms of climate action moving forward it's actually phenomenal to see. There is various cap and trade mechanisms that are moving in terms of regional actions. There's an on the northeast states regional climate action cap and trade systems for carbon trading and energy trading transmissions. Similarly, in California, there's those that are happening. So on the state level, there are actions that are moving forward, irrespective of what is actually happening on the federal level, which maybe is not as notable. Now, that being said, how does that translate into so there's two facets here that I do want to address. Is how does this translate into geopolitical considerations, which I'll
Yeah.
get to, and you mentioned Laurent China, so I'll discuss that in a moment. But before that, I do also want to mention how has that manifested towards action by civil society and by the people. And as mentioned, on a domestic level, it's really propelled it forward. I would say that for the longest time, maybe even since Paris, you often see with social movements, social and environmental movements, there's this sort of parabolic hiatus where there's a peak and then it goes into its troughs and back and forth. And we would say Paris was one of the pinnacles of where the social movements and the climate movement really came forward and was at its height. But since then, it really has been declining and dying down. And there's been a lot of discussion um, in social theories around the sort of the reasons and the rationales behind what is behind a lot of these sort of this decline and how do we move it forward and how do we bring it up again to accelerate climate action? Because a lot of that happens by the populace of the people. Um, but how do we do that? And one would argue that actually the interesting stimulus that has happened with the US's withdrawal from Paris and Trump's instigation of a lot of this has actually created that stimulus for populist movement once again. Both on a domestic level, which is really triggering the climate movement domestically here in the United States quite a bit, but now on a global level too. In the last few years, we would say probably since Dubai's COP, we're starting to see this people summit, which has really kind of come forward in Brazil and Belém, back to where we are now in Belém, that has pushed forward with this group of civil society movement composed of indigenous persons, vulnerable communities, women, gender. We're talking children. We're talking all the communities that are not being heard by blue badges if you pardon me, within the negotiation rooms. But are sort of the most impacted, the most vulnerable, and are not being heard. And a very interesting, and I'm sure you've heard this, unprecedented event did take place in this COP for the very first time in history, whereby the people, the indigenous communities, actually ended up going to the blue zone, to the area where the negotiations take place, barricading through the security, going against the security, and they were not violent. It was not in any way violent, but they did access all the way to, without any form of security, without moving beyond past the security, to the negotiation rooms, chanting and protesting for their demands for mostly for land, but for land rights, for indigenous rights, for communities, for reparations, for all the demands that we're aware of that the People Summit also addresses very, very strongly. Um, and one would argue, so there's two sort of understandings of this, and one would argue on one side that this is sort of violent behavior and actions that should not be taking place, and this should be done in certain forums and settings, and be done in a very sort of diplomatic or civilized setting. But you need to also, on the other flip side, understand that these people have not been heard. These people have not been listened to,
Yeah.
and this rage is being fueled by these negotiators in their white collar suits, sitting in the negotiation rooms, coming out with texts that are, having a lot of these people in the green zone further away, with their demands not being listened to. And so this really has become sort of the last straw, if you will. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. And in so I think it instigated a lot of insights towards those that are within the negotiation process that are really trying to listen to what's being heard for the indigenous groups and the indigenous people, especially being in Brazil, in Amazonia, in the land of 56% is of African descent. The irony of that. So we need to really think about sort of how the heritage of these indigenous groups go back not just towards this land, but also towards the African continent, towards all of our people across the globe. So this is really, really making those connections.
I think Laurent wants to just chip in on this previous point, but
Yeah.
just wanted to make a small comment that maybe adds to your intervention, Laurent. So I think you're absolutely right, Lamaz. Given this geopolitical fragmentation and trade tensions and everything, we are seeing visible limits of these top-down, let's say, approaches. So the bottom-up interventions or the bottom-up, let's say, strategies are actually a solution, and we are seeing that to the examples that you pointed out. My question would be whether or not this distribution of cities, regions, companies, NGOs that are actually active and vocal about what needs to be done is actually a good geographical distribution, or we are seeing, companies that are doing something in the US and only NGOs that are discussing about that in other places. And I think that points to, the let's say gaps that we have across various geographies. Laurent and maybe Lama afterwards to react on that.
Yeah, thank you very much. No, I think a number of very important points have just been touched upon. Uh, First, the gaps you've mentioned, cities, companies,
Yeah.
and communities. Unfortunately, the United Nations is, and the name is very misleading, is for states. So the climate negotiations initially, 30 something years ago, were defined and devised for states to negotiate. Yet, I remember very well once talking, with a number of people, including the mayor of Mexico back in Copenhagen, 2009. And he said, my country has more population and thus more emissions than many countries in the UN system. Yet, we're not supposed to have, any role to play.
Yeah.
And so now going back to your point, um, yeah, this is extremely and critically important that these actors who are not necessarily part directly of the negotiations make their voices heard. And that includes the communities. And that includes communities which traditionally have been excluded for not just UN negotiations, but sometimes even national negotiations or national plans and strategies. And now, when we reach the matter of the Amazon forest, I think here we have a clear example of communities who've been marginalized, exploited, displaced, who have suffered, sorry, from ecocides, which is something which has become very important in international discussions. The policy of destruction of certain ecosystems, generally for the profit of others or for military purposes.
Yeah.
And all these matters are creating now reaction among all these actors. Countries of the global south are very much paying attention to what is decided in terms of climate finance because they know that they will suffer. But there are also all communities, not just in the Amazon, but from other rainforests. Let's think that one other key rainforests suffering also from ecocide and the mining approach to forests is DR Congo. I mean, this is a place which is extremely suffering from people who go for profiteering, deforest, then go for the worst forms of mining, including with slave workers. So this is something we need to address. And this is something that the international community in terms of organizations, think about Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch, or these organizations are paying attention to, because these trends need to be linked to the climate negotiations. If we manage to have consensus, for instance, on some activities which cannot be accepted, on what can get climate finance and what should be excluded, then we're making steps ahead. Let me make it clear, very, very clear. It was mentioned by Lama that, for instance, Texas could have access to finance for the solar industry. And that's great. And this is how we manage sometimes to reduce over time the role being played by the worst emitters or sources of emissions, which can be coal, but also shale oil. Why do I mention this? Is that these days, what is the most spoken about is about quadrupling the amount of climate finance. And this is a key topic. And this is a topic which then leads to having finance for solar energy to be further developed, upscaled in some countries which do not necessarily have the financial capacities to replace what for now has been coal power production, which is the single most polluting source of energy. So the matter of having this lobbying being strongly made in the UN by these different communities, these different groups, these different agendas, but which have found synergies, which have aligned their objectives, is extremely important. And so this is why I'm personally very happy when I see the communities coming from the Amazon forest trying to be heard. Because at the same time, what they are defending is that the system of extraction and quick profit is not accepted. And that Brazil, for instance, doesn't accept it anymore. But then it goes for other countries around the world, and that money is being sent to these countries of the global south, as it was agreed, by the way, 16 years ago, in sufficient quantity to pay for all the forms of development, because this was the idea. And again, I have to go back to 2009, Copenhagen, when the idea of 100 billion per year of climate finance was agreed, including by Barack Obama, Merkel, Sarkozy, etc. The idea was that this will lead to other forms of revenue making for many communities around the world, and that energy systems need to change and fast. It's not been achieved yet, unfortunately. This is why we're in a climate crisis, very obviously. But this is something we can try to work on now, and we have more allies than we used to have. The climate negotiations, I finish with this, are not anymore the monopoly of states and a few group of scientists. It's now being mainstream, and this is why we benefit from new allies who are the local communities, indigenous populations, but also an increasing number of companies, cities, and regions. And this is something we have to be happy with and to keep on pushing ourselves forward. Yeah.
Can I jump in and I want to get also just I know Lemma had some other points to make.
Yep.
Not to pull a quote here, but nature abhors a vacuum, right? And going back to the point of our discussion, one of our main discussion points or the theme, right? Can global cooperation be rebuilt, right? Because we've seen an erosion of it. That's what we've been talking about. And I think we've hit on this, and I just want to underline the point and not beat a dead horse further, which is the idea that if countries and leading nations, as governments, right, are not stepping up or fulfilling or coming through as we expect them. Of course, different nations are still active in different senses, some not so much. Then who fills that void? And what we're hearing clearly, which is, I think, a good point to underline further, is if the governments don't lead, then other groups will, right? You've mentioned different groups from the advocacy perspective.
Yep.
You've mentioned different groups from the technology perspective, right? Businesses. I think the reality, if you can't make a policy case, right, because governments are struggling now, and then the economy and all these things we talked about at the front end, then can there still be a business case and an advocacy case to fill that void? And clearly, to put more of a hopeful spin on sort of the negative aspect of not meeting these commitments and the fallout of that with the warming threshold being breached, is that these other groups are stepping up to, in their own way, in some cases quite modest, right? When we talk about some of these sort of more advocacy type groups, to at least keep the momentum moving forward, right? I mean, the case of like the indigenous groups, I mean, that's if you will not give us a voice, we'll take the voice for us, right? I mean, the verdict is still out, looking ahead in the future on how impactful this sort of substitution of role players will be. But at current face value, it's better to have some level of role player engagement than a completely sort of absence in engagement, to at least keep the car in cruise control and not completely go to a complete stop. Lemma, I know you had a point to make. Just yeah, or Andre.
Okay.
Maybe Laurent, you have a quick reaction. Then I want to turn to Lama. She had one more interesting point, I think, on geopolitics. I want to turn on that. But Laurent,
So sorry, I just wanted to say something
yeah,
about indigenous communities. What we tend to forget is that in the world, first, the main sink for carbon are the oceans, but then it's forests. And forests, be it again the Amazon, DR Congo, or other forms of forests, it can be mangrove forests. The main community is taking care of these forests and helping them to stay healthy ecosystems or indigenous communities. Indigenous communities have developed generally over centuries, if not millennia, ways of working with the ecosystems. And so they are not in a mining and an extraction form of living. And why it's very important is that they are actually synergetic with these ecosystems. So they are very important because one of the key problems of the 20th century has long been that the modern states with the modern ways of life have been eradicating most of these communities, especially the closer from the cities they were, the more exposed they were to new lifestyle that decimated them, sometimes by diseases, and could be behaviors, and then all what you have in between, such as diabetes, etc. To go back to this point, these communities are very important to maintain these healthy ecosystems, which are the key elements for carbon sequestration, and which are much more likely in the at least 2 decades to come to increase the amount of carbon sequestrated compared to technologies such as carbon storage, carbon capture and storage, which is still very small. So what is really important is the link between international groups and sometimes corporations with these communities who used to lack these financial capacities to maintain their lifestyles. And this is something we have seen emerging. So sorry, Lama, I've been long. The floor is yours, but I just wanted to highlight this very important role by indigenous communities.
Thank you very much. Lama, over to you. Sorry for cutting you earlier.
No, thank you. Thank you, Andre. Thank you, everyone. There's several things to also discuss here. The first one is this: I want to react to what Muhammad was referring to, new roles and new players out there. And I think
Yeah.
that that's a really valid and important point as well, is that no longer are we only looking sort of the governments to be able to lead us forward in that trajectory. And I think that that's a great point to make, because even if as we go to the COPs now, we're seeing that the face of the people that attend are no longer just the government delegations. We have,
Yeah.
academics, we have civil society, we have businesses, we have lobbyists, we have people from all walks of life. And this has changed, I want to say, starting from Paris, but really more from Glasgow, where this is sort of this idea of the green zone and these other have really like just ballooned up and exploded. We saw the peak of it kind of in Sharm el-Sheikh in Egypt, and then in Dubai, it just completely exploded even further. Um, which some would argue is, and we had up to what I think in Dubai, there were almost 80,000 or 90,000 people that ended
Yeah.
up attending the COPs, and just a massive number. Of course, not to mention the carbon footprint and carbon emissions and water footprint that comes with that, which one would needs to argue, is it really fulfilling, defeating the purpose of what we're trying to do here. But on the other side, one would argue that this has also ballooned because we're starting to see that the blue zone negotiations is taking too slow, too little, too slow, and that the need for these parallel forums to take place, to have alliances and to build these cooperative measures is necessary and important. And so the COPs are no longer about just the governments coming together and discussing, but it's about bringing together academics, collaborations, the civil society, and having almost a matchmaking between financiers and NGOs and civil society groups that need financing, for instance, for local adaptation to take place.
Yeah.
Because where else would you meet them except for at a COP, at some side event? Oh, I work on solar cooking stoves in Nigeria. Oh, you're kidding. No way. That's fantastic. I've got a sum of money that can actually finance your initiative on the ground. And so it's that kind of matchmaking marriage that can take place on the sidelines of the COP. Can't happen anywhere else. So one would argue, is the carbon emissions worth it? Some would say, yeah, totally. It would absolutely would. But these local players and these other roles that are happening, I think, are very necessary. But I think it's important, if we're talking about other actors coming in, we cannot negate and not the role that now and not mention big tech. And big tech are just a huge pivotal player in this process. And you think, how does that even manifesting within the COP negotiations? And it's just on a whole other level. The way that AI and technology has boomed with big tech companies, and we're talking about the Googles, the Apples, even the Teslas of the world, have really, the big five mostly,
Yeah.
has a huge pivotal role to play in climate. So when we talk about specifically financing, moving forward with financing, this financing gap, we need to look at how a lot of these big tech are moving forward with, trillion-dollar deals. I think it was OpenAI is looking to go onto the market now with a deal on for I think it's $1 trillion, so that it can go on the stock market. So there's things like that where big tech can finance this in a heartbeat. And how does that come to play? they have a lot to play here because their role in the just transition has been very important. And when we talk about the just transition here, and we talk, it's very important for us to understand that we've been talking about it from just transition away from fossil fuels, but we also need to consider just transition to renewables. So there's two facets here of just transitions. There's the just transition away from fossil fuels. How do we do that in a manner whereby those that are employed in the fossil fuel industry can have new skill sets? We don't leave anyone behind, that there's a social and environmental dimension of economic justice that is employed for these people, and we give them new skill sets from fossil fuel industries. But we also need to consider that the just transition to renewables accounts for the supply chain. And here, when we talk about the supply chain, we're talking about all of the rare earth minerals that are being mined in places like Laurent mentioned in Congo for lithium, for cobalt. We're talking about all the slave trade. We're talking about all the child labor. We're talking about all of
Yeah.
these aspects that come into play with the just transition to renewable energies. And now going to back to China, which was my original
Yes.
point, is that the geopolitical spectrum is changing here because when we talk about the just transition to renewable energies and under what the biggest motivator that is needed for is that we are required to triple renewable energies by 2030. That's
Yeah.
the mandate that we have under Paris, to triple renewable energies by 2030. Then how are we going to do that unless we have mandated renewable energies manufactured at cost for us to be able to deploy it to developing countries in a manner that is quick and fast? And who can do that? China. 90% of the photovoltaic panels that are currently produced in the world come out of China and come out of Xinjiang, which, as many of us already know, has a lot of social and environmental labor standards and conditions when
Yeah.
it comes to forced labor and slave labor out of Xinjiang. So we're having the issue now of supply chain issues. What do we do when we talk about the just transition to renewables? Again, we need to consider supply chain, not just in lithium and cobalt for EV batteries and for BESS batteries, but for our photovoltaic panels and powering the triple renewable energy forward. So again, China comes back to understand, if we're talking about where do they stand in terms of their emissions, we need to understand that China currently has already exceeded its target for renewable energy capacity for 2030. It had a target for 2030 in terms of renewable energy. Today of 2025, it has not only reached it, it has exceeded it. And why wouldn't it? The PV panels are being manufactured right there at home. Of course, they have the capacity to do that. In terms of reducing their emissions is a whole other aspect, but in terms of reaching their renewable target, they've already passed it. On a global
Yeah.
level, a lot of other countries are still waiting to do that, whereas China has done it. And in doing so,
Yeah.
what they've also done, if you'll allow me to just finish this final thought, is that they've, in order to bypass a lot of these sanctions that are happening on Xinjiang manufacturing plants, have actually end up, and this is where the geopolitical trade agreements have come in, moving their facilities from China to have PV manufacturing facilities in Saudi Arabia. So now a lot of the PV manufacturing facilities are actually coming out of Saudi Arabia, which is great for Saudi as a fossil fuel country that is also looking to diversify its economy and move away from fossil fuels to have a renewable energy plant right there at home. And for China to move away a lot of those sanctioned mandates that are being imposed by the World Bank, by multilateral development banks on their PV manufacturing plants because of the slave trade in Xinjiang. So it's a win-win almost. But a lot of these dynamics come into play when we think of the just transition and how is it manifesting on a global level. And I'll stop there and allow others to speak.
Laurent, maybe I can turn to you, but maybe I can also add a bit of a question here because we have discussed the context, and I think everything that has been said is vital to understand the context and how COP30 is actually unfolding at the moment. But as you mentioned, Laurent, it was quite clear that remaining below 1.5 degrees of warming is probably no longer viable. So we are looking at 1.5 degrees in the next decade or so. So, the million-dollar question, although you have all alluded to some of the answers or the options of the answers, what success would actually mean for COP30, right? So, with
Wow.
that reality in place, what do mitigation plans look like, and whether or not the NDC should change, and how should we change that, and whether or not, of course, adaptation, ought to be increased in this reality. So maybe I'll start with you, Laurent.
Thank you very much. Here we have a number of things. We have the science of climate change. We have the diplomacy slash real politics of climate negotiations. And we have what remains probably the most likely scenario, which is the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Now, with regards to climate science, it was highlighted before, we would need to have a much more accelerated energy transition within a few years to be able to stabilize our climate system and not to increase too much. Because let's keep in mind, by the way, even if we were to stop right now, the climate is going to increase because there is an inertia, especially in the oceans, and the oceans are most of our planet. But to go back to the science, unfortunately, what we know is that our climate system will increase in the mean temperature and reach 1.5, probably even go above, which is catastrophic. But what we hope is that we can go down after a few years, is that we can go below this threshold back again. The consequences are yet not really known of reaching and going above 1.5. So this is something that I would like people to consider, is that many people, scientists and colleagues who've read the IPCC reports in detail, and I know it's thousands of pages, it takes a lot of time. Well, we were like, I don't have the words. I mean, I cried. I cried when I read about this report. This is the only report I have ever read which made me cry, because I understood that this meant coastal villages in many areas of the world, let's say in Southeast Asia, for instance, but in many other places around the Mediterranean, will disappear because there will not be enough fish stock to sustain villages of fishermen. And I know that some other ecosystems which are already under a lot of stress will disappear as well.
Yeah.
So why do I want to say here is that in terms of what we should be doing and what should be per the science, the goals of this COP are so much higher than what the second area, what is real politics and the ongoing negotiations talking about. The two are unfortunately very separated. And it's not because, by the way, negotiators are against, having great deals being agreed upon. Is that clearly there are different and very antagonistic approaches to working together. If you look at the group of G77 in China, for instance, which is the most influential group of what we could call global South countries, they are pushing ahead for climate finance to be sharply increased. They are pushing ahead for countries of the global North, which are historically responsible for climate change. I give an example. If you look at Malaysia, that some country may look down as a country which cut some of its forests for soya exploitation, agriculture, and so on and so forth. But they are still a carbon sink, And at the same time, we have countries, including mine, France, which for more than 200 years has been heavily polluting our atmospheric system. So our climate negotiations are opposing, unfortunately, some groups from the global North who are chiefly trying to have everyone work together, but do not take fully their responsibilities, their historical responsibilities. We have the G77 in China group of countries, which is the biggest group because it's much more than 100 countries now. It still has the name G77 plus China, but it's over 100 groups, 100 countries, that is pushing for climate finance and more ambition by historically responsible countries. And then we have a number of cases. The US, which officially says it's out, but legally is not out. Because for the climate agreement of the Paris Agreement, to withdraw from the Paris Agreement, you need 4 years. You need to announce you go out, and then after 4 years, you can go out. By the way, this was made by the Obama administration, knowing that Donald Trump may come after, so they made sure that there would not be the US. But still, we have a country which is not working with others. And a few other countries are using this. So Japan, for instance, which used to be a very enthusiastic country, a country which supported a lot ambitions, and the country which gave birth to the Tokyo, um, the Kyoto Protocol, sorry, is not very active. And then we have some island states which think they will get more finance, let's say, from the US by following the US and not being part of G77 and China, even if they are the most at risk of climate change. So we have a very difficult landscape to negotiate, and that doesn't mean it will not give, it will not move ahead. The key problem of climate negotiations is generally not to find an agreement. It's what kind of agreement, and more importantly, at which pace is made the progress. Because the climate crisis, and that's what we need to understand, over the past 20 years has accelerated and is at a pace which is much faster than our capacities, not only to mitigate our emissions, but even to adapt to the climate crisis. And that's something we need to really think about, because when in Europe, and I will finish with this, around the Mediterranean, in Europe, for instance, in the north of Mediterranean, rich countries are not even able to properly adapt to the wildfires during the summer because temperatures have gone so high, then you really wonder who is able to adapt to it. And I'm having a big question mark when you know that what suffered California not long ago.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to understand that moving ahead is good, but we need to be at the pace we need, at the very specific pace, which is normally much faster to be able to cope with the environmental degradation, especially the climatic degradation that we see happening in the world. And this is the issue. And so my question, million mark question mark, is, will we be able within a decade, because this year we know we won't, but will we be able within a decade to really be at the right pace? And what will generate this global understanding that we are going to face environmental issues like we've never faced before if we don't get our acts together?
Mohammed, if I can redirect this question mark to you and maybe also ask you what would success mean these days in Brazil?
Yeah. I'm going to go very quantitative with this one.
Mm.
I think we've covered sort of qualitatively with Laurent's answer of what should be the outcome. I think and I'll pull on a few threads that he put out. We've talked about the constraints financially, right? And there are some unfortunate criticisms or realities of having the COP in Brazil, and this isn't new to the Brazil COP, but it's this persistent issue of access to the COPs, which kind of came up earlier, Lemma's point about indigenous populations and other minority groups. But this one literally access because of distance, right? Brazil is not a very easy place for people to go to from most other parts of the world. And then attached to that is the cost of travel, right? So not only access to attend the meeting, but access in terms of limitation of being able to go because the groups that you want to engage, we've talked about, don't have the financial resources to go there. And not to tip my hat to what's coming next. This could raise the similar issue, could be even further sort of compounded if next year's COP ends up in Australia, which is what's in discussion right now.
This would be a disaster.
It could be
This would be a
more of the
disaster.
same. Yeah, more of the same, but worse. But to answer your question on what is a tangible output, I think discussions there have sort of are moving slightly towards this direction. Mitigation, unfortunately, is taking a big hit for all the very things we talked about, not enough funding. People are scaling back in terms of mitigation efforts and just transition and emission reduction, all the things we've talked about. I'm not going to rehash all the great points that came out. Adaptation seems to be the place to go, and granted, yes, much like mitigation, funding helps. But my point with adaptation is you can enforce adaptation policies that at a national or subnational or city or community level that aren't costly, right? To me, a lot of adaptation measures can be more behavioral, right? To a certain extent. There's limitations, of course, to what people can do or communities or countries can do, but I think you have more room to push more on adaptation and mitigation for the reasons we've talked about. The other point that came up, Brazil being sort of a big ecosystem representation
Mhm.
aspect, pushing forth on issues related to nature and environment as connected to climate change. Point that came up on carbon sinks, right? I think is where as Brazil as a nation could make a win. Another thing that came out recently over the first week that I think has some legs, which is this a global sort of climate health initiative. I forget the proper terminology now off the top of my head, that came forth, this plan to finally, formally, we all know it, we all live it, which is how climate change impacts health. We
Yeah.
know how it affects us in terms of warming, heat illness, heat death. You know, a lot of warm places experience this already, and it's going to be amplified. How it affects water, which then affects livelihoods and water and sanitation, which is needed to live, but also for communities, especially agro communities, to grow food and sustain themselves. Extreme weather, how that affects infrastructure and causes fatalities. We've seen that in many parts of the world, and certainly in the Arabian Peninsula, and now we're seeing extreme weather rising in the Mediterranean. So I think that's something that could be a successful output once you add more chairs around that table as far as that plan goes forth. My view is that what comes out of Brazil will be modest in comparison to previous years, but I don't think that in of itself is a failure. I think it's just a reflection of the state of the world that we're in, as we said earlier. But there are some small wins and successes that can come out, and those are just a couple of examples.
Maybe Lama, the same question, whether or not you're optimistic or pessimistic about this COP and what would success mean in your view?
Thank you, Andre. I'm a little bit more realistic in the way I look at the COPs now. After attending over 10 COPs, I don't necessarily consider the COPs either a success or a failure. I think that the
Right.
way that they function is even even Copenhagen, which was pegged as the biggest failure of COP ever. I disagree. I feel that when we inch towards something, it's still there is progress that is made. Um, Paris, if you could consider it one of their biggest successes, also had major drawbacks, and so I don't think that it's
Mhm.
necessarily healthy for us to peg a COP a success or a failure. There are aspects that we inch forward towards, and there are alternative platforms that we can build upon those COPs to be able to provide enhanced momentum. But to build upon what Mohammed was saying, and I really like his sort of quantitative take on the various aspects that can be moved forward. I think that that's really notable. And I really liked how he mentioned sort of the health initiative has moved forward. There are other things that have actually come to light in this COP that have never really been discussed before that I think is very is really great for us to finally be discussing in these forums and is really great. So as mentioned quite repetitively and over in this seminars is that we've exceeded the 1.5, and with our current outlook of NDCs, it looks like our NDCs quanti is going to be taking us anywhere between beyond 2.6 degrees. What does that mean? What does that mean specifically then for, let's face it, the reason 1.5 was put and not 2 degrees back in Paris was for the small island states. So we're talking about the states specifically. Other states, to a great degree, can handle 2 degrees, but it's the SIDS that will be inundated and will be underwater beyond 1.5. And so this is where we need to consider the SIDS. Um, and when we think about the small island states and what's been happening, interestingly, in within this COP, there are some very interesting kind of agreements and slightly before that have actually come into place. So the as many of you might have already heard, the agreement between Tuvalu and Australia for this partnership for Tuvalu's relocation to Australia has become actually a finalized sort of entity to be for them to be able to move and to relocate. This is the first ever agreement that has happened by a SID nation towards to be relocated to another nation. And many studies that were actually conducted on the ground empirical ethnographic studies with Tuvaluians will tell you they never wanted to leave. This was never the case. You ask them where would be your most favorite place to move. and Laurent, you were mentioning how, certain reports would put you to tears. These comments by the Tuvaluians put me to tears. They never wanted to leave. How could they ever leave their homeland? This is their native indigenous land. So for them to come today and actually come with an agreement to Australia and say that we are willing to relocate means there's no other option. This is it. This is
Yeah.
an existential threat for them, which is awful. It's abominable. But if we try to also understand where this comes from and we try to, I don't think we've mentioned too much about climate migration and refugees and how this is going to be manifesting moving forward. There are a lot of issues when we talk about migrants moving and integrating into new home countries and all of that, of course, of the sort of the legal rights that come with it, the various integration, language, cultural heritage, maintaining your ethnicity, all of the complexities and nuances that come with refugees in any setting, economic persecution, political, let alone climate. Now, with the aspect of Tuvaluans or climate migrants, and we don't mention them as refugees because they don't have refugee status, and this is a
Yeah.
legal labeling. So that's why we term them as migrants and not refugees. This is also something that the UNFCCC process has tried to discuss with UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, to see how to change the legal framing of refugees to also incorporate environmental and climate-induced disasters as well. But as of yet, there is no climate refugee label because there's no legal status. And so, sorry to jump back on this, is that with the Tuvaluians, this aspect now of if you were to move and you were to migrate to another country and to be integrated into this other homeland, what does that mean when it comes to having a state? What is your state? You become stateless because your land is underwater. And so this aspect of, do you employ another citizenship? Do you take on the citizenship of that country? How does that manifest? And interestingly enough, one of the things that has actually come to light here, and again, I go back to tech here and some of the big tech, is with the integration of the metaverse and with AI, there is this new concept that has come out when what is referred to as digital states. And with this idea of digital states and digital statehood, this integration of Tuvalu into Australia, you can retain your culture, your identity, your state in that aspect, which has paved the way for a lot of other states to begin to reconsider and think, okay, this is an existential threat for me too. I know that we've exceeded 1.5, we will not be able to go back. What are some innovative ways that we can begin to look towards what are our options? So to answer in a very long-winded way, some of your question about successes is I think that we have found some interesting innovative solutions. I won't call them promising. I'll say that is yet to see how the legal framework of that pans out. But I would say that there are some interesting steps that have moved forward that I think could really, really help the most vulnerable on this planet.
Yeah.
Maybe
But
Laurent,
here,
final remark. Yeah.
yes, I just would like to say, as at the end of each and every COP, we can look at some incremental steps forward. Okay, we can enjoy them, we can congratulate ourselves. But if we lose track of the bigger picture and how late we are, how out of the pace we should be at we are, then we enable the situation of Tuvalu, the situation of many islands which will disappear. Many cultures will be under the sea. And whether they are on servers that you need to pay for to conserve or not, that is another story. But their ecosystems, their life, their places, their stories will disappear gradually. And by the way, we can relocate maybe a few millions of Tuvalu or another island. But what about the currently at risk 45 to 50 million people in the Bay of Bengal? Who will accept them? Or who will accept even 10% of them? We see that the problem when you start with this is that no one will accept this. And by the way, the reason why in the negotiations people fight against the idea of climate refugees is that the big countries which have the capacities don't want to ever have to welcome millions of refugees, let alone dozens of millions. And this is the kind of scale we're talking about all around the Indian Ocean and in many countries. So I would like to say, yes, we'll make steps forward. but we should put the pressure. And this is why I think it's healthy to say when a country fails to reach the objectives, it should be shamed. It should be named and shamed. And Copenhagen was a failure. The pressure was upon them. So at the last minute, they agreed on one thing, which made the world move ahead, which was climate finance. They made the biggest promise for climate finance. Then we, in the global south, because this is where I'm situated, we move forward to push for it, to use it. And we need to continue that. And if Brazil is not able to put enough pressure, we need to put pressure. We, academics, corporations, local communities, etc., we need to put pressure so that we act faster, bolder. Because at the end of the day, it's hundreds of millions of people, agriculturalists, fishermen, etc., who are at risk to see their heritage being destroyed by sea level rise, by extreme environmental events. This is what we try to stop. So I think we need to think about that. We need to have the highest ambitions, and we need to be tough. If Brazil does well, congratulations. If they don't, we'll be on them, and we'll be on the next. And I look forward to having more ambitious COPs, and we need to be more ambitious. Incremental changes are not what we can talk about. This was the 1990s and early 2000s. We are in a totally different situation. So we need to live up to 2025, where the situation is dire, and we need to be following it in the right manner, I guess.
I think with this call to action, it's a good end of our conversation. Unfortunately, we've reached the end of the seminar, of this conversation. It was very insightful, I think, and a lot of topics that we haven't addressed. That's my only regret, I guess, after this hour spent with you, my guests. Thank you very much for the contributions that we have here. I think we were discussing a lot of things related to this bottom-up approach and how different actors are actually moving some of the targets forward. We have discussed quite a lot about the geopolitics around climate action, and I think that is changing as we speak, and a lot about how different actors will basically engage in the next few years, and how COP will actually need to somehow redefine itself. Whether or not we will discuss about successes or failures, that's, the jury is still out on this. But action and climate action is changing as we are moving ahead with the next COPs. So thank you very much for this and for the conversation. And to the viewers, we'll see you on the next one. Check our websites and our social media accounts for the next conversation on climate action and energy transition. Thank you very much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.